In May 2025, US President Donald Trump had once again raised a threat against the world. This time, however, against smartphone makers, like Apple and Samsung. The reason is because he wants these smartphone makers to move production lines from Asia to the United States. In a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump stated that, "I have long ago informed CEO Tim Cook of Apple that I expect their iPhones that will be sold in the United States of America will be manufactured and built in the United States, not India or any place else." He further mentioned that it would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product, otherwise it wouldn't be fair. Now, there's a lot of problems that these smartphone tariffs would bring to the US. They would raise the cost of phones for US consumers if the tariffs were implemented, and if production lines were moved to the US, it would make these phone prices far more expensive, with some estimates saying that a made-in-USA iPhone could cost over $3,500, up from the current $1,199 for an iPhone 16 Pro. But the problems of the United States are small. It is small in comparison to a country called Vietnam. Why is that the case? This is because Vietnam is a major producer of Samsung phones. The Samsung Group operates 6 manufacturing plants in Vietnam, along with one major R&D center and a sales office, with a total investment of about $22.4 billion. 2 massive factories in northern Vietnam, one in Bac Ninh province, Yen Phong Industrial Park, and another in Thai Nguyen province, Yen Binh Industrial Park, produce the bulk of Samsung's smartphones and components. These factories are described as high-tech cities staffed by hundreds of thousands of workers. Official sources and media reports indicate that Samsung Vietnam's workforce is well over 100,000 people. For example, Samsung Vietnam recently noted that its Thai Nguyen complex alone has created about 150,000 jobs, direct and indirect, over 10 years. The company also maintains sizable facilities making semiconductors, displays, through Samsung Display, and consumer electronics in Bac Ninh and Ho Chi Minh City. In total, Samsung has poured billions of dollars into its Vietnam operations since 1989, making it the country's largest foreign investor and exporter. According to industry analysts, roughly 60% of Samsung's annual phone production, out of about 220 million phones, takes place in Vietnam. Samsung makes hundreds of millions of electronic devices in Vietnam each year, from smartphones to laptops and appliances, and ships them worldwide. In 2024, Samsung's Vietnam operations generated tens of billions of dollars in exports. One report estimates Samsung Vietnam shipped about $54.4 billion worth of goods in 2024, mostly mobile phones and parts. This astonishing output has made electronics, led by Samsung, a cornerstone of Vietnam's export economy. In 2024, electronics exports, including phones, computers, and parts, reached about $126.5 billion, roughly 1/3 of Vietnam's total exports. Samsung's Vietnamese factories supply many markets, but a large share of their output goes to the US market. Vietnam runs a huge trade surplus with the US, largely on electronics and appliances. In 2024, the US imported roughly $136 billion in goods from Vietnam, making America Vietnam's largest export market. Electronics are the dominant category. Vietnam exported $126.5 billion in electronics last year, of which a significant portion was shipped to the United States. For example, in 2023, US imports of mobile phones from Vietnam were about $8.1 billion. Samsung devices likely accounted for a large share of those phones, since Samsung is the number 2 smartphone brand in the US. In fact, Samsung is regularly the second largest seller of smartphones in the US after Apple. So, the imposition of a 25% tariff on Samsung phones imported into the US would raise the landed cost of those devices sharply, and is likely to damp US demand. Analysts warn that if the high tariff rate were applied, it would hit Samsung's Vietnam operations hard. However, that's not the only problem here. It's the fact that Trump had also imposed a 46% tariff rate, although currently paused, to Vietnam. These tariff threats have led Samsung executives to be confused by the size of the tariff, and that Samsung would be a primary victim if the duties took effect. One strategy under discussion is to shift some production out of Vietnam to other countries to avoid the highest tariffs. Samsung confirmed in its Q1 2025 earnings call that it is considering relocating some manufacturing to limit tariff exposure. In particular, reports indicate Samsung may route US-bound smartphone production to its plants in India, which faces a lower proposed tariff, 26%, than Vietnam's 46%. Indeed, news outlets report that Samsung has begun talks with Indian EMS players about moving part of its output to India, much as other tech companies are doing. Moving production would be costly and time-consuming. Factories must be built or expanded, but it is seen as a way to mitigate tariff losses. In the meantime, Samsung officials say the company will use its global footprint flexibly to cope with tariff changes. To see how this plays out, it helps to look at trade data. Vietnam's overall exports to the US are huge, and electronics dominate them. According to the UN Comtrade database, US imports from Vietnam reached about $142 billion in 2024, up from $119 billion from the previous year. Vietnam's surplus with the US topped $123 billion last year, one of the highest trade imbalances around the world. Given the scale of Samsung's Vietnam output, tariffs on its products could ripple through Vietnam's economy. Vietnam's growth model has relied heavily on exports, foreign investment, and job creation by companies like Samsung. At present, the electronics industry provides millions of jobs in factories and supply chains, and it helped fuel Vietnam's export-led growth in recent years. If US tariffs make Vietnamese electronics much more expensive, there could be a slowdown in orders. Economists warn of significant damage. The chief economist at Vietnamese investment firm Vina Capital estimates that in a worst-case scenario, Vietnamese GDP might fall by nearly 2% due to the tariff. But take note that this estimate may not even include the recent 25% tariff threat on smartphones published by Trump. The supply chain impact could be complex. In addition to Samsung, many smaller Vietnamese companies supply parts and services to Samsung's factories. If Samsung scales back Vietnam production, those local suppliers would feel the pinch. Reuters quotes South Korean business leaders in Vietnam saying there was initial panic over Trump's tariff threat, with some companies even planning workforce cuts. Industry insiders report that even a 90-day pause in tariffs led to a wait-and-see mood, but uncertainty remains high. Parts makers and contract manufacturers are already exploring alternative plans. For example, Samsung's suppliers are discussing ramping up output in India or South Korea instead, and some are looking into expanding operations in Mexico where tariffs are lower. To put it into simplicity, if Trump's tariffs, both his 46% tariffs on Vietnamese imports, currently paused, and his 25% tariffs on Samsung products were to go on, then it would indeed cost Vietnam a lot. We could see Samsung move its production sites out of Vietnam, which would most likely cause the Vietnamese economy billions of dollars of exports every single year. That could cost the economy tens of thousands of jobs. Some think tanks warn that Vietnamese exports could lose up to 15 to 20% of their US market share if the high tariffs stay in place. Higher costs could slow foreign investment too. Reports already say some planned factory expansions in Bac Ninh have been put on hold amid the tariff uncertainty. If exports shrink, Vietnam's GDP and currency may come under strain, and lower import revenues from the US could loosen government budgets. In sum, a 25% US tariff on Samsung's Vietnamese-made products would reverberate throughout the Vietnamese economy. Samsung's factories are among the linchpins of Vietnam's manufacturing boom, employing hundreds of thousands and underpinning a large share of exports. Analysts estimate that such a tariff could shave a couple percentage points off Vietnam's GDP growth, while costing Samsung billions in profit. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.